Since the dawn of consciousness, one question has plagued humanity. What is the meaning to life? Some of the greatest thinkers throughout history have devoted their entire lives to trying to figure out what the answer to this question is. However, many of those smart thinkers came to the same conclusion. Life does not have meaning, so it's up to us to choose our actions and our goals in order to imbue our lives with meaning and purpose. So to conceptualize this, it's important to remember that nothing in the outside world is going to give our lives meaning. Our lives have meaning depending on the actions we take and the choices we make. Today, I want to go over 5 different philosophies or philosophers' concepts from Carl Jung, Friedrich Nietzsche, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Arthur Schopenhauer, and Viktor Frankl on how we can live in the face of this uncomfortable truth that life has no inherent meaning, and some of the things we can do in order to provide our life with some purpose. So before we get into things, if you wouldn't mind subscribing to our channel where we try to figure out what it means to be and how to become superhuman, and tossing a thumbs up on this video, that would be greatly appreciated. First off, we have got Carl Jung, who is a Swiss psychologist that lived from 1875 to 1961, was largely accredited with the finding of psychoanalysis. Carl Jung thought it was extremely necessary for individuals to go through a process of what he called individuation, which was bringing the unconscious aspects of our psyche to light and integrating them and becoming whole. Instead of thinking of ourselves as purely conscious beings, we really need to essentially look under the hood as to what's driving our emotions and behaviors, even our worldview and beliefs. He didn't think that this was an easy process by any means. He actually said, quote, "There's no coming to consciousness without pain." However, he thought that this was a very worthwhile pursuit, seeing as he also thought, quote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." This whole concept of becoming who you truly are is the individuation aspect. And he said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. How does one go about doing that? Well, Carl Jung had the concept of the shadow, which is these aspects of ourselves that we do not want to look at. They are things that we would actually be maybe even a little bit embarrassed or ashamed of being or having within ourselves. And he thought one of the best ways that you could identify these things within yourself is looking at the world around you and what bothers you about other people's behaviors. And actually, usually what's happening in that moment is our psyche is projecting the frustration onto other people that we have been unable to look at within ourselves. Those things that bother you about other people, whether it be their laziness, their passive aggression, maybe look at that as a signal that those are undesirable traits within ourselves that we have not yet made ourselves conscious of. This aspect of going into the dark in order to find the light rings constantly throughout Carl Jung's concepts. He actually said, quote, "No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." So to wrap up Carl Jung before we move on here, the worthwhile pursuit for humans to go through is the process of individuation and essentially becoming our true selves. But again, remember, that means integrating the aspects of yourself that you might not be very proud of. Philosopher number 2 of the day, which is Friedrich Nietzsche. He was a German philosopher who lived from 1844 to 1900. He is probably one of the most famous modern philosophers. You'll see in every university philosophy course, they will definitely be covering Nietzsche at some point. He has very much influenced our modern way of thinking. One of the central concepts to Friedrich Nietzsche was the will to power. So he thought every living organism on this planet, not even just humans, but that every organism has a drive and wants and desires and craves power, that it wants self-expansion. He actually thought too as well that if we don't allow ourselves to pursue this power drive in a healthy way, if we can't admit that every single one of us wants power, what's going to end up happening there is that drive will actually go underground into our unconscious, kind of like what Carl Jung was talking about, and that this drive would come forth in very ugly ways. So for instance, passive aggression, or also you can see this take place, one of his concepts was slave morality as well, which is that when people are low down on the social hierarchy or the power hierarchy within societies, what ends up happening is if they don't feel that they are adequate and capable of climbing that social hierarchy, what they do, and this is still a power play, is they will critique people with power, critique excellence, critique greatness, and this is still them in a way trying to ascend the social hierarchy, but instead of trying to climb that ladder, they're just ripping people off above them. However, the end result is that if they rip off everybody above them, then they will be at the top of that ladder, even if they haven't moved. So for Friedrich Nietzsche, he thought it was very important that we consciously move and direct this in a positive manner for ourselves. He says, quote, "There is a universal need to exercise some kind of power or to create for oneself the appearance of power." And he thought that somebody's character could largely be measured by their will to power. So for instance, he says, quote, "I assess the power of a will by how much resistance, pain, torture it endures and knows how to turn to its advantage." So one of these concepts within power was that you have to be able to embrace suffering and overcome it, and you overcome those obstacles in your life. Being an existentialist thinker, Friedrich Nietzsche believed that life in and of itself is suffering and there is no escaping this. He actually said to live is to suffer and to survive is to find some meaning in the suffering. And so for him, this meaning largely derived from our abilities to become powerful individuals. So to summarize Friedrich Nietzsche before moving on, seek power, but do it in healthy ways. Third on the list, we have got Fyodor Dostoevsky, who lived from 1821 to 1888 and is one of Russia's most famous novelists, short story writers, essayists, and journalists. Numerous literary critics consider him to be one of the best writers of all time. Many people put him right up there in the ranks of even Shakespeare and such. I think most people would give Shakespeare that crowning #1 spot just because of how revolutionary he was at the time. However, the depths of Dostoevsky's thinking in novels are truly unmatched. He very much dove into the human condition or the psychological aspects of humanity and life. And Dostoevsky was actually largely accredited with being one of the first or foundational existentialist thinkers. So again, to think that suffering in life is inevitable and that there is no greater meaning to life. That's kind of that whole, it's a very oversimplified explanation of existentialism. However, the major themes throughout his books, which I would highly recommend reading, are that we should seek to have meaning and fulfillment in our life through love, compassion, and self-sacrifice. He said, quote, "The mystery of human existence lies not in just saying alive, but in finding something to live for." These things to live for Dostoevsky were largely love, compassion, and self-sacrifice. That's a very oversimplified explanation of his philosophies, but more or less boils down to that. His protagonists and the heroes of his stories largely embodied these traits. One of the things that he pointed out, which I really love, is that he said, quote, "To love someone means to see them as God intended them." Because I think what ends up happening in our relationships is we can try to mold the people around us into who we think we need them to be in order to feel happier or loved or understood or whatever. And I think you see this in relationships all the time when people get into them, is they nitpick at one another until they can try to essentially slowly turn them into their desired version. But true love is looking at people much like how Michelangelo looked at a slab of marble and a sculpture, which he said it's the sculptor's job to reveal what is already inside. So he thought there was already a statue within the marble slab that he was about to embark on changing, but it wasn't his job to impose an external design upon it. It was his job to bring out what was already within. And that's a very different mindset than trying to change somebody. Dostoevsky thought that truth and adherence to truth, or at the very least not lying, is pivotal in our ability to love other people. He said, quote, "Above all, don't lie to yourself. The man who lies to himself and listens to his own lie comes to a point that he cannot distinguish the truth within him or around him, and so loses all respect for himself and for others. And having no respect, he ceases to love." He actually said, quote, "What is hell? I maintain that it is the suffering of being unable to love." Moving on here to our fourth philosopher, Arthur Schopenhauer. He lived from 1788 to 1860, born in Germany, and he is largely thought of as the pessimistic philosopher. He was an existentialist as well, so he thought that life is largely suffering. However, he was one of the first Western thinkers to combine Western philosophies with Eastern philosophies, and so he kind of came to this almost like existentialist mixed with Buddhism type ideas. He thought that there was no escaping the fact that life is suffering. Despite the fact that he had a very bleak view of the world, and much like the other existentialist thinkers, thought that suffering is inescapable. So he thought in the face of this realization that life is suffering, most people just try to run away from it, that they try to numb themselves with cheap pleasures, overeating, drugs and alcohol. He thought that one could minimize suffering not through escaping into meaningless pleasures, which he thought actually would end up creating their own sense of suffering. This is where he very much brought in those Eastern philosophies of asceticism, which is kind of that idea of swearing off pleasures and desires, that Buddhist idea that most of our suffering comes from having expectations and desires, and then those expectations and desires not being met. He posited that to minimize suffering, we should just not have those expectations and desires in the first place. I think it is good to lead a minimalist kind of lifestyle. However, I do see limits to this. At the end of the day, I do have goals and desires, but I just focus on the fact whether they're meaningful, whether I think that they actually bring about positivity to myself and the world around me, or whether they are just mindless desires. Those are the ones that I definitely try to swear off as much as possible, that consumerist mentality. But Arthur Schopenhauer thought that we shouldn't be upset by the fact that life is suffering, that the best thing we can do is put our shoulder down and carry on through life head first. He also thought that a true noble person, somebody of high character, doesn't complain about their suffering and actually feels greater empathy and more distress over the suffering of others than their own. One of my favorite Arthur Schopenhauer thoughts is that, quote, "A sense of humor is the only divine quality of man." So what I take him to mean by this is that the best quality humans have is the ability to laugh in the face of suffering. And I actually think this is so pivotal for most people, because the minute you can start laughing at a scenario in your life, all of a sudden that issue has less power over you. I don't think we should take ourselves so seriously. Life in and of itself is a little bit absurd, so we should have an absurd mentality when dealing with it. Lastly, we have got Viktor Frankl, who lived from 1905 to 1997. Frankl was an Austrian psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor who coined the discipline of logotherapy. So he thought that the best way to deal with patients that were struggling mentally and just people in life is to find meaning for their lives. And this is largely what this video is about, right? Is how to act in the face of knowing that life is largely meaningless. He actually said, quote, "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances and to choose one's own way." This concept is that even him being locked into Auschwitz, he was able to look around him and see that many people were just utterly suffering, obviously, but that the select few that were able to still provide their lives with meaning, whether it was, say, some other of the prisoners, they made it their goal on a day-to-day basis to take care of those around them, or that for him, for instance, his driving force that kept him going throughout all of that was him wanting to bring his work to the world of logotherapy. He thought it was a very worthwhile thing for humanity to learn, so that was his reason for survival, and that was what gave his life meaning. That's what made it worth continuing forward. And that's what he's saying when he's talking about nobody can take away our perspective. When people are suffering, it's actually largely not the suffering itself that is causing them distress, but a lack of feeling like there's no meaning for their suffering. So to differentiate between suffering for a purpose or meaningless suffering. So for him, he thought that we needed to find a reason, find things to keep going for. He says, quote, "Ultimately, man should not ask what the meaning of his life is, but rather he must recognize that it is he who is asked. In a word, each man is questioned by life, and he can only answer to life by answering for his own life. To life, he can only respond by being responsible." One thing that I really love that Frankl pointed out as well is that, quote, "Happiness cannot be pursued, it must ensue." Meaning, most people put happiness as their North Star and they try to run towards it for their life, like, say, for instance, again, Schopenhauer was pointing out with these cheap desires and mindless entertainment and such. But that happiness is something that truly ensues from responsibility in life. So let's say true happiness is what we get from starting a family or having deep, meaningful relationships with one another, or pursuing work or a career that has greater implications for the world around us. That these actions of responsibility are what will end up providing our lives with happiness, but that happiness has to come from something else, that it has to, yes, ensue. We need to focus on meaning, and that happiness comes from meaning. All right, so that wraps up our 5 philosophers on the meaning to life. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Is there a philosopher that you think touched on the subject of how to have meaning in life very well that I missed here? Or is there a thought or concept from one of these philosophers that might help bring out or expand on the things that I have said? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, and we'll catch you next time.